What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel and to another Overwatch League discussion video. In today's discussion, I wanted to take a look back at the caster predictions that were put up on the Overwatch League website right before Stage 1 started. I thought it would be fun to see how right/wrong all of these people were, and I think the results are pretty interesting and I think you'll get a kick out of it. So without wasting any more time, let's get straight into things. So first up is Puckett, and as you can see from his division champions, Final Four, and 2019 champions, he has some pretty mixed results, which is a common theme for every caster I'd like to add. Anyway though, one thing Puckett was spot on with was his division champions. He went 2 for 2 in that department, and he also got half of the Final Four correct since he had the NYXL and Titans in there. London and Seoul ended up failing to get that far, but he wasn't all that far off with them since both of them did make the playoffs after all. As far as champion pick, well yes, the NYXL let Puckett down, but this is a respectable pick considering the fact that the NYXL finished in 3rd. And his reasoning for picking them is fair too, since they did appear to pick up some good talent to their already stacked roster coming into the year. Then for his MVP pick, he uncreatively went with Jonak, and I can understand why anybody would pick him coming into Season 2 since he won it the season before, and he was already considered to be a top flex support in the league, if not the best coming into 2019, but I wouldn't say this pick ended up being super accurate for more than the obvious reason, of course. It's more important to remember that he didn't even make the top 5 in the voting process. I will say that Jonak was still very good though. Definitely top 3 in the league at his position. Jonak played well this year, but this MVP prediction definitely did not hit the mark. Moving on to his Rookie of the Year prediction, he had Decay, and while I think this was a good prediction coming into 2019, Hoxel was clearly better, hence why he won the award instead, obviously, and Puckett added that he thought Decay would be a star damage dealer in the league, and to a certain extent that was true. He was a good Zarya and serviceable on DPS, but he definitely still has a lot to learn. He was a star, but he's not near that superstar level yet. Decay was good, but Puckett maybe overhyped him a tiny bit in my opinion. Then finally there's his breakout team pick, which was the Vancouver Titans, and there's not much to say here. The Titans most definitely were a breakout team. They won their division, had the best record in the league, won a stage title, and made the grand finals. Good prediction by Puckett here. Next up on the list we have the Chat himself, Uber, and like with Puckett, he too had the NYXL winning it all, making the Final Four, and winning the Atlantic division. And to add on to it, he also had half of the Final Four correct in his prediction since he had the Spark and NYXL. Where he starts to differentiate from Puckett though is how high he was on the Gladiators. Not only did he predict them to win the Pacific, but also to make it to the Final Four. I can't really blame Uber for riding the Gladiators hype train though. I, along with many others, believed they were going to be a very strong team, and to a certain extent they were. They won a playoff series and finished top 6 in the regular season. So from the Final Four aspect, it's not that bad, but the Pacific Division champion pick was kind of off. Even though they had a pretty good record this year, they still did finish their division in 4th place due to the overwhelming competition they were up against. Moving on to MVP though, he had Libero. Now this was a pretty fair pick in my opinion, since Libero is a consistent and versatile player with pop-off potential, and that's kind of the reason he ended up picking him. That versatility he possesses is very valuable, but at the end of the day, like with his teammate Jonak, he failed to even qualify for the top 5 in MVP voting, so I'll have to say that this MVP prediction was pretty off the mark. Then rounding out his predictions, he had Erster taking home Rookie of the Year and the Spark as his breakout team. So starting with the Erster pick, I find it to be very respectable. Erster was easily one of the best flex players in the league this year, and he couldn't really shine on Brig since she's not a flashy hero, but he dominated in Stage 4 no matter what he played, and while Brig is boring to watch, he was definitely one of the top Brig players in the league still. Uber is looking like a smart man for hyping up Erster. Sure, he didn't win any awards, but he still sure as hell had himself a good year. As for the Spark selection, well, I'd say he was right about them. There were some moments this season where they were regarded as championship contenders, plus they won a few playoff matches, finished in the top 4 of the regular season standings, and made an appearance in the Final 4 of the playoffs. The one issue I have with this prediction though is that Uber said the Spark would come out of the gate strong, and that isn't entirely true. It was actually quite the opposite. In Stage 1 they struggled at times while Gushue was improving on his ability to speak Korean. It wasn't really until Stage 2 and Stage 3 when they finally started to hit their stride. Other than that though, I don't have any problems. Moving on to hexagrams, the first thing I have to say is, oh lord, look at that Final Four. More specifically, the Guangzhou Charge. Not looking too good there, huh, Hex? The London and Gladiators picks weren't so bad though since they made the top 8. The New York picks to win the Atlantic and the Grand Finals are the same as Uber and Puckett, so we'll kind of just move past that and discuss the Spark pick to win the Pacific Division. So, this pick really isn't that bad. It's kind of like the same thing as having the Gladiators win it because yeah, the Spark are a strong team, but the Titans and Shock are far better. Now, how about that MVP guess? Mono was actually a solid person to go with. I know he failed to make the top 5 in the voting process, but many people think he should have, and rightfully so. For about 3 of the 4 stages, his name was constantly mentioned when it came to discussing the top 3 main tanks in the league. Mono was consistent, and his team often lived and died by his in-game performance, so I personally don't think this prediction was that far off. So for Rookie of the Year, Hexagrams chose Godsby, and this prediction's pretty reasonable. I don't think he's one of the first people that comes to mind for me personally for top rookies, but even though Hex was wrong, he definitely was correct about some of the words he had to say about Godsby. He was most certainly clutch and one of the best players on his team for sure. His Zarya was also one of the best in the league, and he looked good when flexing onto Sombra during the GOATS meta too. And after initially struggling to start Stage 4, he really turns it around and looked like the star we all know he's capable of being. So sure, he didn't win any sort of award, but Hex clearly had every right to hype this guy up. But then things get a bit uglier when we talk about his breakout team. Even after hyping up the Spark so much and some of their players too, he decides to throw a curveball and say the Charge are his breakout team. The Charge most definitely had their ups and downs in 2019. They were all over the place, but I have to say that they definitely were a breakout team. For one stage, that is. In Stage 4, they were one of the best teams in the league, and many people thought they could be a title contender heading into the playoffs, but we all know how that went for them. I wouldn't say the Charge were the breakout team of 2019, but Hex definitely was right about them being a dark horse who consistently finished in the top half of the standings, so I give him credit there. Moving on to the next caster, we have Achilios, and he's the first person to really shake things up since he picked the Spitfire to win the Atlantic and the Grand Finals. Not to mention he's the first person on the list to pick the Fusion to make the Final Four. So the Fusion pick looks kind of dumb for most people, I'd say, but at the time it did make sense. The Fusion were the 2018 runner-ups after all, but even so, this pick doesn't look super good since they failed to even qualify for the overall playoffs while just barely finishing in the top 10 of the standings. The London Championship pick is a bit of a big yikes though. Again, it's understandable like with the Fusion since London won it all in 2018 and have repeatedly shown the ability to come through in the clutch, but even so, London did not live up to these expectations at all. They came in 3rd place in the Atlantic since New York and Atlanta had a better record, and they certainly were not even close to winning the Grand Finals as they failed to even win a playoff game. But Achilles shouldn't feel too bad as there's plenty of other people who fell into the same boat as him in this article. Also, he's the only other person on here other than Puckett to pick Vancouver as the Pacific Division champions. Moving on to his MVP pick, he decided to go with Gushway, and congrats Achilles, you are the only caster who came close to getting his or her MVP prediction right. Gushway made the top 5 for the MVP race, so good on you Achilles. Sure, you picked the wrong person, but the fact that you even came close deserves some credit. His reasoning behind his selection is simple and yet very true. Gushway is without a doubt a beast. He was probably the best Winston in the league and just one of the best tanks in general if I'm going to be completely honest. He played well even with a language barrier. Solid pick from Achilles here. But then unfortunately Achilles goes back to being horribly wrong as he strangely picked Guard to win Rookie of the Year. But before I even get into how bad this was, can I ask a question to you guys? Why the heck would you say Gushway wins the MVP but not Rookie of the Year also? I'm kind of taking a jab at the Overwatch League here too. How on earth does Hoxel get Rookie of the Year but then he isn't even an MVP candidate when you literally have 2 of his rookie teammates in there? It just doesn't make any sense to me. But anyway, this Guard pick is strange to say the least. Guard really didn't play all that much after Stage 1, and he just wasn't that good. I think he had his moments, but he wasn't anything special. And now look at him. London dropped him because they don't like what he brings to their team. Maybe he could still excel with time like Achilles says, but he certainly didn't do much of that in 2019. This is definitely one of the worst Rookie of the Year predictions I've seen. Oh, and he also picked the Spark to be his breakout team, and I've kind of already touched base on my thoughts with this because of Uber, so we'll just move on to the next caster. And that, of course, would be the mad lad himself, Bren. So like with Achilles, he was very high on London, but what's interesting is him having the San Francisco Shock winning the Pacific. And fun fact, he's one of only 3 people from this article to make that pick. And while the Titans would be the ones to ultimately win the division, Bren's instinct to be high on the Shock coming into this year definitely paid off. Plus, the Shock almost did win their division. They were just a couple of wins behind, so I'd say Bren was fairly close. Having the Shock and Titans in the Final Four also proved to be a wise decision. It's unfortunate that he messed this section of his predictions up by having London and Philly in there in his Final Four, but it's okay. It made sense at the time, so I can't blame the guy. Then as we move on to his MVP, he has Gesture. With how Gesture played in 2018, this pick did make sense back then, but oh man did it prove to be very wrong. I'll leave it up to you guys to decide, but was he ever even a top 5 main tank at any point in the league this year? You could maybe make the argument during Stage 4, but there's no way you could say so in Stages 1 through 3. His Reinhardt was pretty mediocre even after Birdring got benched. Gesture was kind of a letdown this year, if I'm going to be completely honest. Me and clearly Bren expected him to play far better than he did. Moving on to his Rookie of the Year selection, he had Gushue, and it kind of falls under the same boat as Achilios picking him to win MVP. It held up to be a good decision. Gushue was outstanding this year, and as I said before, he was an MVP candidate, so I don't have much to say about this prediction. But what I do have something to say about is his breakout team, which was the Shanghai Dragons. So this one I kind of have mixed feelings for. On one hand, the Dragons failed to make the playoffs and had 2 stages that left a lot to be desired. But on the other hand, they did win Stage 3 and were just 1 map away from making the top 8. So I'd say Brent is half right here. The Dragons were a crazy breakout team in Stage 3. I think that much is certain because of that title run. It was something else, but they had some rough moments this year too. Nonetheless though, this prediction in my opinion is respectable. And Brent was certainly right about them being a much improved team that came together unlike their 2018 counterparts. Now we have Doa, and yikes. To put it nicely, these predictions were awfully optimistic. I just can't even wrap my head around this, even after knowing about these predictions since February. I mean, was Doa even taking this seriously at all? He had the Charge winning the Pacific Division and making the Final Four alongside the Florida Mayhem. You know, that team that came in 20th place this year. I pray that Doa didn't put any thought into this because this has not aged well. I don't even know what possessed him to make him think the second worst team in 2018 would suddenly become title contenders after not acquiring any superstar talent to start the year. The Valiant Final Four selection is not looking too great either. But hey, at least you got a few of your NYXL picks right. Good job, buddy. This hurts to look at, so let's keep moving on. Maybe it gets a little bit better. Oh wait. It really doesn't, because Doa then goes on to crown Flower as his MVP. Now, I will say I had faith Flower would be a solid player for the NYXL this year, but I didn't think he'd ever be an MVP candidate. That just seems silly, and let's be honest, Flower's time with the NYXL was quite the disappointment. Not only did he get little playtime, but he never really impressed except for a few moments in Stage 4. Now, I would say Doa's predictions end on a good note, but at that point, I'd just be lying to you. So first off, in case you were wondering, he actually decided to pass on the Rookie of the Year prediction, but for Doa's breakout team, and it's hard for me to not laugh while saying this, he went with the Florida Mayhem. Do I even need to bother explaining myself when saying this was totally insane? What the heck was Doa thinking when he made these predictions? It's just so bizarre. But moving back to some more normal predictions, well, I guess as normal as you could possibly get, we next have MonteCristo, who also happened to pick the Shock to win the Pacific and make the Final Four. And unsurprisingly, he did what most people did in this article by saying New York would win the Grand Finals and that London would make the Final Four. None of these Final Four predictions overall are anything unique or unseen, so let's focus in on his MVP. So Monty decided to go with Profit, and this really isn't a bad pick. The guy won the Finals MVP in 2018 and has repeatedly shown the ability to be clutch in significant games. And like how Monty said, Profit is crazy versatile, and he has been one of the hard carries on the London Spitfire since day one. And Profit definitely had some MVP caliber moments this year, but mostly in the second half of the year. He was still a really good player though, don't get me wrong. He was literally the best Brig and Zarya player on his team when Goats was meta. I know that's not saying much, but still. Monty missed the mark on this prediction, yes, but I think it was within reason to pick Profit, so I'm not going to make fun of him. Now, where you probably could make fun of him though is with his Rookie of the Year pick. Really? Bozzy of all people, Monty? Now, he didn't say he was confident in this selection, but some of the comments he made about the prediction were not accurate. Bozzy did serve as a good flex DPS for sure, but only because of his Doomfist during the playoffs really. Other than that, the guy barely even got stage time, and for a little while even found himself as a two-way player. And finally, we have his breakout team prediction, which was the Shanghai Dragons, and the same thing applies for him that I said with Bren earlier. It's a decent pick, but it's not the best. I will say that he was right about the Dragons being a playoff contender though. They nearly made it. They fell one map short. Up next is Mr. X, and other than the Spark winning the Pacific and London making the Final Four, these early predictions are solid. The big thing that jumps out for me is that he got 3 of the 4 teams in the Final Four correct, with the only prediction wrong, of course, being London, and that's pretty impressive. Mr. X is actually the only caster in this article to get more than half of the teams in the Final Four correct. His words about the NYXL were actually kind of true towards the end of the year as well. In the playoffs, they did look quite motivated, so good on you there as well, Mr. X. He then picked Jonak as his MVP, and we'll kind of just move past that since we already talked about the Jonak MVP thing with Puckett at the beginning of the video. Let's instead focus in on his Rookie of the Year pick, which was Roar. So I'm not sure about the rest of you, but I too thought Roar would be in contention to win this award. He was a good player on Kongdu Panthera, and he seemed like a great replacement for Fissure, who got traded to the Dynasty. But Roar unfortunately went through some rough patches this year. He often seemed to suffer from communication issues with the rest of his team, leading to him going in by himself and or straight up feeding. Again, this is another one of those picks that makes sense at the time, but then when you look at it now, you're like, oh Oh damn, I was really wrong. It happens all the time to all of us. Oh, and Mr. X also hopped on the Dragons breakout team bandwagon, so I'll just move on to the next caster now. And that next person on the list is Semmler, and as you can see, he kind of falls under the same place as many of the other casters before him, as he hyped up the Spark, he had New York winning their division in the grand finals, and thought London and Philly would be in the mix for a shot at the title again after their prior success in 2018. Moving on to his MVP selection though, he decided to go with Dufran, and needless to say, this prediction is a big yike since Dufran was already out of the league by stage 2, but he definitely was right to think of Dufran that highly. He is easily one of the most mechanically gifted players to ever touch this game after all, not to mention that he's flashy, skilled, and super popular. And for someone who had never played Zarya before in his life, I have to say that Dufran did a decent job. And who knows, maybe if he stayed committed to the league, he would have elevated his play to an MVP level. So I'd say this pick from Semmler is reasonable, but it went horribly wrong since Dufran retired before stage 2 even began. But one thing Semmler was on the money with was his Rookie of the Year prediction. Because guess what? He actually picked Hoxel. Let's give a round of applause for Semmler for being the only caster to get Rookie of the Year correct. His words on Hoxel ended up being super spot on as well, which is kind of scary. He most certainly was one of the league's elite damage dealers, that much is obvious. And oh, Semmler also happened to go with Shanghai for his breakout team, so we move on to Sideshow now. So Sideshow followed a similar path to Bren, as he thought London would win the league and their division and put a lot of faith in the Shock while getting half of the Final Four correct. His MVP selection is where things get a bit more questionable though. Badoshan has always been a good flex support, yeah, but he's never even came close to being considered an MVP. Badoshan actually ended up having a pretty quiet year too, so rip to this prediction. But Sideshow in his defense did go on to say that he really didn't know who to give this award to, while adding that Badoshan would only win it if Prophet and Gesture underperformed. I'm liking the way he ended things though. Predicting Violet to win Rookie of the Year was a great call. Sure, he didn't win the award, but Sideshow clearly was right about what Violet was capable of. He was widely regarded as one of the best flex supports in this league, and Sideshow's statement about him having strong potential was spot on. And just when you think that things can't get any better for him, Sideshow one-ups himself by picking the Shock as his breakout team of 2019. Although, I have to say they probably even surpassed his own expectations with how they won the grand finals and all. They were really dominant, but nonetheless, Sideshow was 1000% correct about the Shock being a good team. Moving on from Sideshow, we have the always lovely Zoe, and as you can see, compared to everybody else at least, there's nothing too out of the ordinary with her division winners, Final Four, or Grand Finals pick. She seemed very high on the Gladiator, Spitfire, and Spark like with many other analysts, and thought New York would be the front runners to win it all. Her MVP selection of Jonek makes her the third person to predict him to win the award in back-to-back seasons, and with Zoe in particular, I can't say I'm surprised that she picked him just because she's always been really high on him, but Rookie of the Year is where things start to stand out a bit more with her predictions. She couldn't really seem to make up her mind with this award, so she went with a tie between Gushue and Diem. Now obviously the Gushue pick, as I've said before with previous casters, is really good. I can't really say the same for Diem though. Like, he didn't necessarily have a bad year or anything, but his Zarya wasn't anything special, and he couldn't really seem to adapt when the meta favored Reaper, Mei, and Doomfist over sniper heroes. Diem played well, but he did not deserve to be considered a potential Rookie of the Year selection in my opinion. She was right about him dominating though, but it wasn't on a consistent basis. But then, after having some clear ups and downs with her predictions, Zoe ends it on a good note by predicting the Shock to be her breakout team of the year, and I think that's where I'm going to leave it with her and move on now. So next up is Wolf, and although he's really high in the Titans and he's always been a big supporter of them, he surprisingly had the Spark winning the Pacific over them, and like with many others, he had the Spitfire winning it all, and he thought London, Vancouver, Philly, and the Spark would round out the Final Four. But let's move on to some of the more interesting stuff, because he had Bumper winning the MVP award. And while he did miss the mark there, some of the things he said about Bumper definitely held up to be true. Him being a good Reinhardt player definitely did benefit his team during the GOATS meta, and his style of play definitely caught the attention of many. It didn't always impress the people watching, but still, he was definitely an attention grabber. While Bumper wasn't the MVP of the league, he was easily an MVP when it came to entertainment. To cap off his predictions, he had his Rookie of the Year being Dufran, and his breakout team as the Spark. Since I've kind of already gone over what I think of both the Spark and Dufran winning these kinds of awards, I'll just say that both of these picks are sensible, and that the Dufran selection went horribly wrong for obvious reasons that I've already gone over, and I'll leave it at that. Now we round out our talent crew. Last but certainly not least is our main man Malik, who actually decided not to predict his Rookie of the Year or MVP. But that's okay, because he still had some interesting selections we can talk about. So first off, he thought the Seoul Dynasty would be the ones to win the Pacific. I think a lot of people saw Seoul as a much improved team heading into 2019, but I don't know if anyone really considered them to be the front runners to win their division or anything. I don't know if this pick had any bias behind it since Malik is a big Seoul fan, but regardless, it was still pretty off. The other prediction that Malik made was the Atlanta Reign being the breakout team of the year, and to be honest, this really ended up not being a bad pick at all. The Reign kind of struggled at the midpoint of the season, but they had a decent stage 1 and a crazy good undefeated stage 4 that made many believe they were potential title contenders, and this pick only looked better after the Reign took down the Shock in the first round of the playoffs. Also, I'd like to add that Malik's comments on this team were pretty spot on. He was completely right in the sense that Atlanta did not come storming out of the gates to start, but like he said, he thought they would be a sleeper team towards the end of the season, and that's kind of what they were. I think people thought they'd be a good team in stage 4, but I don't think anyone really saw that perfect 7-0 record coming, so Malik did pretty good with his prediction, don't you think? And that's basically it, guys. That's the entire cast and their predictions before the 2019 season started. There's a few big takeaways from this. One is that literally nobody gave anyone but the NYXL or Spitfire a chance to win the grand finals. Another is how it seemed to be a common consensus that the Spark would be a top team in the league. The last thing that I think is fun to look back at and see is how many people put their trust in the Spitfire and Fusion to go far this year just for them to play below their expectations. I also find it funny how some people were terribly wrong about some things, but also extremely accurate with others. Take Doa picking Florida to make the Final Four, or Semmler being the only person to correctly predict Hoxel to win Rookie of the Year, for a couple of examples. Anyway though, that's just about going to do it, so make sure to let me know what you think of all of this down in the comment section, and if you enjoyed this content, then be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you're new, as I plan to do more of these types of videos in the future. You can also further support me and interact with me by following me on Twitter at ATP Overwatch, and by joining my Discord server through the link in the description. As always, thank you all so much for watching today's video. I really do appreciate it, and until next time, this is ATP, signing out. Peace.